I first realized Karen Davenport had a problem with my cat shelter when I saw her standing at the edge of my yard, arms crossed, her thin lips pursed in disapproval. It was a chilly November morning, and I was outside refilling the insulated shelter I had built for the local feral cat colony. The small wooden structure, tucked neatly in a quiet corner of my yard, was packed with straw for warmth. A few of the neighborhood strays, Mittens, Shadow, and Rusty, had already claimed it as their own, curling up inside when the temperatures dropped. Karen, however, looked like she had just stepped into a crime scene. She cleared her throat loudly. "Excuse me, Lena, but do you really think that thing is appropriate for the neighborhood?" I sighed, already exhausted by this conversation before it even began. "It's a cat shelter, Karen," she scoffed. "We don't need stray animals loitering around. You're encouraging them. It's disgusting." I clenched my jaw. Actually, these shelters help prevent disease and keep the cats from freezing in the winter. It's part of a TNR program, trap, neuter, return. They're fixed and vaccinated. They live here, whether you like it or not. Karen's nostrils flared. "That's not how this community works, Lena. This is Maplewood Estates, not some filthy back alley. I'll be talking to the HOA about this." I bit back my irritation. "You do that, Karen." And with that, I turned back to my shelter, ignoring her beady-eyed glare burning into the back of my head. I had no idea what she had planned next. The next morning, I stepped outside with a fresh blanket and a handful of treats for the cats. And my shelter was gone. I froze, blinking at the empty space where it had stood just yesterday. At first, I thought maybe some prankster kids had messed with it. But no, the ground was undisturbed, no signs of it being dragged or knocked over. Someone had stolen it. And I had a very strong suspicion about who. I stormed down the sidewalk, straight toward Karen's house. Before I could even knock, the door swung open. Karen stood there, arms crossed, a smug smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "Something wrong, Lena?" she asked, her voice syrupy sweet. I took a slow breath. "Where is it, Karen?" Her expression didn't waver. "Where is what?" "My cat shelter. The one you've been complaining about. The one that mysteriously disappeared last night." Karen placed a mock-offended hand over her chest. "Oh, are you suggesting that I had something to do with that?" I stared at her. "Just give it back." Her smugness flickered, just for a second. Then she sniffed. "I have no idea what you're talking about." And she slammed the door in my face. I stood there, my fists clenched, my blood boiling. Fine. She wanted to play games? I was going to win. I didn't bother wasting time arguing with the HOA. Karen had connections there, and I knew they'd just brush me off. So instead, I made a different call. To Animal Welfare Services. When I explained that a community cat shelter had been stolen, the officer on the phone, Officer Gregson, immediately perked up. "Wait," he said. "This was an insulated shelter? Built specifically for a TNR colony?" "Yes." "And someone just removed it?" "Yep." There was a long pause. Then Gregson sighed. "That's actually illegal. Those shelters are protected under our community animal welfare policies. If someone stole it, they could be fined heavily." I smiled. "That's what I was hoping you'd say." 2 days later, a marked animal welfare vehicle pulled up in front of Karen's house. I watched from my porch as Officer Gregson, a tall, no-nonsense man in a city-issued jacket, knocked on her door. Karen opened it, her face brightening when she saw his uniform, probably thinking she was about to get me in trouble. That lasted exactly 3 seconds. Because when Gregson pulled out his clipboard and started talking, her expression dropped. I couldn't hear everything, but I caught fragments. Removal of designated shelters. Against city animal welfare regulations. Fine of up to $2,500 per violation. Karen's face went sheet white. I grinned. That evening, just before sunset, I heard scraping noises from the side of my house. I peeked outside. And there was Karen, dragging my cat shelter back across my yard. She looked miserable. Her hair was a mess. Her designer sweater was speckled with dirt. And her jaw was clenched so tight I thought her teeth might crack. She plopped the shelter down right where it had been, then turned and stormed away without a word. I stepped outside, arms crossed. Thanks, Karen. She froze mid-step, her hands fisted at her sides. Then, without turning around, she muttered, "Go to hell, Lena," and marched back to her house. I laughed, walking over to check the shelter. Everything was intact. I refilled it with fresh straw, set out some food, and within an hour, Mittens and Shadow were curled up inside, safe and warm. The battle was won. But something told me Karen wasn't finished yet. And I was more than ready for her next move. I should have known Karen wouldn't take her defeat quietly. For a few days after she was forced to return my cat shelter, things were suspiciously peaceful. No glares from across the street. No smug remarks while she trimmed her already immaculate hedges. I should have been relieved. Instead, I felt like I was waiting for the next storm to hit. And I was right. Because exactly 1 week later, my HOA mailbox exploded with violation notices. The first notice came on Monday. Dear Ms. Carter, our routine inspections have found that your property violates Maplewood Estates aesthetic and maintenance guidelines. The following issues must be corrected within 7 days to avoid a fine. Unapproved outdoor structure, your cat shelter. Visible pet feeding station in front yard. General disorderliness affecting neighborhood harmony. I laughed. Not a real laugh, more of a sharp, bitter chuckle. I had lived here for 3 years without a single complaint. Now, suddenly, my property was an eyesore? I knew Karen had pulled some strings. And I wasn't about to let her win. The next morning, I marched straight into the Maplewood Estates HOA office, a beige building that reeked of printer ink and passive-aggressive bureaucracy. Behind the front desk sat Janet Holloway, the HOA secretary, a woman with the personality of a wet napkin and a strict loyalty to whoever had the most influence in the community. Janet gave me her usual fake smile. "Ms. Carter, what can I do for you?" I slapped the violation notice onto the desk. "You can start by explaining why my cat shelter, fully legal under city animal welfare laws, is suddenly a problem." Janet barely glanced at it. "It's an unapproved structure under HOA guidelines." I narrowed my eyes. "Since when?" She adjusted her glasses. "That rule has been in place for years." I smirked. "Funny, because my neighbor down the street has a birdhouse the size of a small garage, and I don't see him getting a violation notice." Janet fidgeted. "Bingo. This wasn't about aesthetics. This was Karen's revenge." I leaned forward. "I assume the HOA is aware that removing TNR cat shelters is illegal?" Janet pursed her lips. "We are reviewing the situation." "You do that," I said, grabbing my paperwork. "Because if I get another violation notice, I'll be bringing my lawyer into the conversation." I turned and walked out. For a few days, things were quiet. Then, just when I thought Karen had finally given up, the cats started disappearing. It happened gradually. First, Mitten stopped showing up for his usual morning meal. Then Shadow. Then Rusty. By the end of the week, the entire feral colony was gone. I checked everywhere, under porches, behind sheds, even near the wooded lot at the edge of the neighborhood. Nothing, and I had a very bad feeling about it. So I checked my security camera footage. And what I saw made my blood boil. At 2:43 a.m., a black SUV rolled up in front of my house. A figure, a woman, tall, with a familiar stiff posture, stepped out. Karen. She was carrying a cage. She crouched near my yard, shaking something in her hand, probably food, before luring a cat inside. Then she slammed the cage shut, loaded it into her car, and drove off. I stared at the screen, my jaw clenched so tight it hurt. Karen wasn't just messing with me. She was stealing the cats. And I had proof. The next morning, I made 2 phone calls. First, to Animal Welfare Services. Second, to the local news. By noon, Officer Gregson was back in the neighborhood, standing on Karen's doorstep. This time, he wasn't alone. He had another officer with him. And a search warrant. I watched from my porch as Karen opened the door, her face going from annoyance to panic in real time. "What is this about?" she screeched. Gregson held up a clipboard. "We have reason to believe you are illegally trapping and removing community cats, Mrs. Davenport." Under city law, that is considered animal cruelty and theft. Karen turned red. That's ridiculous. Those cats are a menace. They don't belong here. Gregson didn't flinch. Ma'am, if we find any evidence that you've been trapping or harming these animals, you could be facing criminal charges. Karen went pale. I folded my arms, enjoying the absolute karma unfolding in front of me. Then, one of the officers checked Karen's garage and found the cages. 3 of them, with cats still inside. Karen was fined $5,000 for illegal trapping and animal endangerment. But the real punishment? The entire neighborhood found out. Within hours, the news had spread. Maplewood Estates' beloved busybody and self-appointed moral authority had been caught stealing cats. People stared at her when she walked down the street. Neighbors who used to gossip with her now crossed the road to avoid her. Her reputation was in shambles. And as for my cat shelter? Still standing. And this time, even Karen wouldn't dare touch it. A week after her humiliation, Karen avoided me like the plague. But one night, as I stepped outside to check on the cats, I noticed something strange. A small envelope tucked under my doormat. I opened it. Inside was a single note, typed in bold letters. You may have won this time. But I don't forget. Watch your back. No name. No signature. But I knew exactly who sent it. I smirked, tearing the note in half. Bring it on, Karen. This war wasn't over. And I was more than ready for the next battle. For the first time in months, things were quiet. Too quiet. Karen had vanished from neighborhood gossip circles. She no longer stood outside pruning her already immaculate hedges, no longer hovered around HOA meetings like a vulture waiting for a fresh kill. Her humiliation over the cat incident had shattered her carefully crafted image of suburban superiority. But I knew Karen too well. She wasn't the type to forgive or forget. She was just waiting. And when she finally struck, it would be calculated, vicious, and personal. I just had no idea how far she was willing to go. It started with a letter. A crisp white envelope, official-looking, tucked neatly into my mailbox. When I opened it, my heart dropped. Notice of HOA violation and property dispute. Dear Ms. Carter, after a recent review, it has come to our attention that your property may be in violation of Maplewood Estates' land use regulations. Based on boundary assessments, portions of your lot, including the area where the unauthorized outdoor cat shelter is placed, may extend onto community-owned land. Due to these discrepancies, you're required to remove all unapproved structures within 10 days, or further action will be taken. Failure to comply may result in legal proceedings or eviction from the HOA. Sincerely, Maplewood Estates HOA Board. I stared at the letter, my pulse pounding in my ears. This was Karen's revenge. She couldn't touch my shelter directly anymore, not after the city got involved. So instead, she was trying to rewrite the rules. She was trying to get me kicked out of my own home. I clenched my jaw. Oh, hell no. I stormed into the HOA office the next morning, slamming the letter onto the desk in front of Janet Holloway. Janet barely blinked. I assume you're here about the property dispute. You assume, right? I said, crossing my arms. Where's your proof that my property is violating any land use regulations? Janet smiled, that fake, practiced smile that HOA board members are trained to perfect. We received a complaint that required us to investigate the matter. I snorted. A complaint from who? Let me guess, Karen Davenport. Janet didn't answer. I leaned forward. I know exactly what's happening here. Karen lost, and now she's trying to use legal loopholes to come after me. But here's the problem. I have my original property records. That wiped the smug look off Janet's face. I pulled out my own folder, spreading documents across the desk. Here's my lot boundary survey from when I bought the house. And guess what? My cat shelter is well within my property lines. Janet's lips thinned. She knew she was cornered. After a long pause, she cleared her throat. I suppose we could conduct another review to ensure accuracy. I smirked. Yeah, you do that. I should have known Karen wouldn't stop there. The night after my visit to the HOA office, I noticed cars gathering outside her house. At least half a dozen people were inside, their voices muffled but urgent. Karen was plotting something. And when I saw Roger Hale's car parked in her driveway, my stomach tightened. Roger Hale, the former HOA kingpin who had been ousted after his corruption was exposed. If Karen was bringing him back into the equation, then she was planning something big. 2 days later, a new problem arrived. An official-looking man in a suit knocked on my door, clipboard in hand. "Ms. Carter?" he asked. "That's me. I'm here from the Maplewood Zoning and Property Commission. We've received an HOA request to conduct an inspection of your property." My blood boiled. This was Karen's next move. If the HOA couldn't evict me outright, they were going to try to find something, anything, to use against me. I forced a polite smile. "Sure, come in." But what they didn't know was that I had a plan of my own. While the inspector walked around my property, I casually asked, "So, does the commission do a lot of inspections for HOA complaints?" He chuckled. "Not usually. We prioritize legitimate zoning disputes." This request came from the HOA board, pretty aggressively too. Almost like they're targeting you specifically. Bingo. I smiled. "Well, I'm glad you're here, actually, because I have a counter-complaint." The inspector raised an eyebrow. "Oh!" I handed him a thick folder. Inside were dozens of zoning violations from other properties, including Karen's. Her fancy backyard gazebo? Unpermitted. Her extended driveway? Violated setback regulations. Her decorative fence? 2 inches too high. The inspector flipped through the pages, his face unreadable. "These are substantial." I shrugged. If the HOA is so concerned about regulations, I assume they'll be happy to enforce them fairly. The inspector smirked. "I'll make sure this gets reviewed," he said. And just like that, Karen had no idea the storm that was about to hit her. The fallout was glorious. The zoning board issued fines, not to me, but to half the HOA board members, including Karen. Suddenly, the very people who tried to push me out were scrambling to fix their own violations. And Karen? She snapped. She marched into the HOA office, screaming about how this wasn't fair, how this was all my fault. By the end of the month, Karen had resigned from the HOA board. 2 weeks later, she put her house up for sale. By summer, she was gone. One afternoon, as I sat on my porch, enjoying the quiet, Mark Reynolds wheeled up beside me. "So," he said, smirking, "she's really gone, huh?" I nodded. "Finally." Mark chuckled. "Bet she's still seething about it." I smiled, watching as Mittens curled up inside the shelter, completely undisturbed. "You know what?" I said. "She can stay mad." Karen was gone. Her house was sold, her reign of terror over Maplewood Estates had collapsed, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I could finally breathe. But Karen wasn't the type to go quietly. 2 weeks after she left, I received an anonymous letter in the mail. There was no return address. Just a plain white envelope, sealed a little too tightly. When I opened it, a single typed note slipped out. "Enjoy your victory while you can. You've made some powerful enemies." A chill ran down my spine. At first, I thought maybe Karen had sent it herself, one last bitter attempt to rattle me from wherever she had slithered off to. But something about it felt different. The wording, the tone. It wasn't her usual passive-aggressive garbage. It was a warning. And I had a feeling Karen wasn't the only one I had pissed off. A few days after receiving the letter, I started noticing changes. Nothing huge at first. Just little things. My garbage cans weren't emptied on trash day. My mail started arriving late, or not at all. My security cameras picked up a black SUV circling my street late at night. And then, the shelter was vandalized. Not destroyed. Not like before. But someone had ripped off the roof, leaving the straw and blankets inside soaked with rain. It was a message. Not from Karen. But from someone worse. I wasn't stupid. Karen had been a loud, entitled nightmare, but she was predictable. Whoever was behind this, they were patient. Which meant they were dangerous. So I did some digging. The new HOA president, George Whitaker, had taken over after Karen and Roger's downfall. On paper, he seemed ordinary, a retired businessman, quiet, never involved in drama. but something wasn't adding up. One afternoon, I decided to pay him a visit. I knocked on his door, my gut twisting with unease. When the door opened, George stood there, looking me up and down. No fake smile. No neighborly greeting. Just cold calculation. He said finally. Lena Carter. I didn't like the way he said my name, like he had been expecting me. I just wanted to introduce myself, I said, forcing a polite smile. We haven't formally met, and, well, it seems like there's been some issues with my property again. George tilted his head. Issues? I pulled out my phone, showing him a picture of my vandalized shelter. Somebody tore this apart, I said. And I find it strange that right after Karen left, I start having problems again. George sighed, shaking his head. You seem to think there's a conspiracy against you, Miss Carter. I kept my expression neutral. Am I wrong? A slow smirk curled across his lips. And then he leaned in slightly. You made a lot of noise when you took down Karen, he murmured. People like us? We don't forget things like that. People like us. My stomach tightened. He knew. He knew everything. And he was picking up where Karen left off. I left George's house feeling uneasy. Karen had been a nuisance. A bully. But George? George was something else. So I did what I do best. I started digging. And what I found was worse than I ever imagined. George Whitaker wasn't just a random retiree. He had been involved in multiple HOA scandals in different neighborhoods over the years, pushing people out, selling properties to private investors. He had connections with Roger Hale. While Roger had been taken down publicly, George had kept his name out of the spotlight. And most importantly, he had been working with Karen the entire time. This wasn't just about a cat shelter anymore. This was organized corruption. And now, I was their biggest problem. The next morning, I stepped outside to check the mail. There, on my porch, was a dead rat. A clean, deliberate kill. Its body placed right at my doorstep. Not an accident. A message. I swallowed hard, my pulse hammering in my ears. This was bigger than Karen. Bigger than Roger. And if I wasn't careful, I might not win this time. I stood frozen on my porch, staring at the dead rat lying at my feet. Not a coincidence. Not some stray cat's kill. This was deliberate. A warning. And I had a very good idea who was behind it. George Whitaker. The new HOA president. The man who had picked up where Karen left off. The man who had whispered to me, people like us don't forget. My stomach twisted, but I forced myself to stay calm. Because I knew one thing for sure. If I showed fear, he'd win. Less than 24 hours after I found the rat, I received an official notice from the HOA. This one wasn't like the petty violation letters Karen used to send. It was worse. Notice of formal property review. Dear Ms. Carter, due to multiple complaints regarding unauthorized structures and improper animal care practices, the HOA will be conducting a formal investigation into your property. A board-approved inspector will visit your residence on Monday at 10 a.m. Failure to comply with HOA regulations may result in fines, removal of unapproved structures, or further action. Sincerely, Maplewood Estates HOA Board. I clenched my jaw. This was it. George wasn't just trying to bully me, he was trying to set me up. If they could prove I was violating any rule, they could fine me into oblivion. And if I refused to cooperate, they could push for legal action, or even force me to sell my house. This was their endgame. They weren't just trying to take down my cat shelter. They were trying to take me down. I wasn't going to let them win. If George thought he could scare me into submission, he was about to learn the hard way that I wasn't going anywhere. I called Mark Reynolds. He answered on the second ring. Lena? What's wrong? George is making his move, I said, explaining the inspection. Mark sighed. I knew he'd pull something like this. The man is a damn snake. You still have friends on the board? I asked. Mark chuckled darkly. More than George does. Let's expose this fraud before he buries you in HOA paperwork. Next, I called Linda Morales. The former teacher-turned-accidental activist had been one of my biggest supporters during the Karen years. She wasn't about to back down now. That son of a bitch, she said after I told her. Oh, they want to play dirty? Fine. Let's show them what happens when they mess with the wrong people. By the time I hung up, I had a plan. And when Monday came, George Whitaker was in for a surprise. At exactly 10 a.m., a black SUV rolled up in front of my house. A man in a cheap suit stepped out, clipboard in hand. Behind him stood George Whitaker, arms crossed, wearing that same smug expression that made me want to throw a brick through his windshield. I stepped onto my porch, arms crossed. "Good morning, gentlemen." The inspector barely glanced at me. "Miss Carter, I'm here to conduct an HOA property compliance review. If you could step aside, I'll begin my inspection." George smirked. "Let's hope everything is up to code." I smiled sweetly. "Oh, absolutely. But before you start, this is private property, and I have the right to record the inspection." I held up my phone, camera already rolling. The inspector hesitated. George's smirk wavered. Mark and Linda stepped forward, notebooks in hand. "We'll be documenting this process as well," Mark said casually. "You know, just to make sure everything is done fairly." George's eyes narrowed. Because suddenly, he realized. He had walked into a trap. The inspector walked the property, checking every detail. But the further he went, the more uncomfortable he looked. My lot was clean. My cat shelter was legal under animal welfare regulations. My home was in perfect condition. By the time he finished, his face was pale. He cleared his throat. "There are no violations." George stiffened. "Are you sure?" The inspector looked uneasy. Then, something clicked in my brain. This guy wasn't just some random HOA lackey. He was scared of George. I stepped forward. "You've done these kinds of inspections before, haven't you?" The man blinked rapidly. You know what's really going on here, don't you?" I pressed. "You know this isn't about property violations. This is about George trying to push people out." The inspector swallowed hard. And then, in the smallest voice, he muttered, This doesn't seem right." "Bingo." Mark pounced. "Do you know how many properties George has done this to?" The inspector hesitated. Then he broke. "Too many," he muttered. I've seen complaints disappear. People fined over nothing. It's all shady as hell." George's face turned red. "That's enough," he snapped. "This inspection is over." But it was too late. Because I had everything on video. That night, the footage went public. Mark sent it to local reporters. Linda spread it across social media. Within 24 hours, an official investigation was launched into George Whitaker and the HOA's corrupt practices. By the end of the week, George was forced to resign. And just like that, the last of Karen's allies had fallen. A month later, I stood on my porch, sipping a cup of coffee. Mark wheeled up beside me, smirking. "You finally won, huh?" I grinned. Damn right I did. The new HOA board was made up of actual, decent people. The endless violations, threats, and intimidation? Gone. And my cat shelter? Still standing. As it should be. For the first time since moving to Maplewood Estates, I could finally say, this was home. And no one, not Karen, not George, not anyone, was ever going to take that away from me again. It had been a month since George Whitaker's downfall. For the first time in years, I didn't wake up to a new HOA violation notice in my mailbox. No more bullshit inspections. No more late-night intimidation tactics. It felt peaceful. But peace in Maplewood Estates never lasts. Because one afternoon, while I was refilling my cat shelter, a car I didn't recognize pulled up across the street. A sleek black sedan. Tinted windows. And out stepped a woman in a pristine navy suit, with sharp heels and sharper eyes. She scanned the neighborhood like she was taking inventory. Then, she turned, her gaze locking onto me. And she smiled. That's when I knew. The war wasn't over. That night, Mark, Linda, and I met up at my house. Who the hell is she? Mark asked, rubbing his jaw. Linda frowned. I swear I've seen her before. I pulled up my phone, searching for Maplewood Estates HOA records. And then I found it. Cynthia Holloway, former real estate attorney, recently appointed HOA consultant. And, most importantly, Janet Holloway's daughter. My stomach dropped. Janet Holloway, the same HOA secretary who had covered for Karen, who had helped Roger manipulate property laws. Cynthia wasn't some random outsider. She was here to rebuild what we tore down. The next morning, I found a new letter in my mailbox. Not an HOA violation. Something worse. Notice of proposed HOA amendment. Dear homeowners, as part of Maplewood Estates' continued efforts to maintain community standards, we are introducing a new amendment proposal. Outdoor animal restrictions. Due to growing concerns about property damage and hygiene, a motion has been put forward to ban all outdoor animal feeding stations and shelters. A board vote will be held next Friday. Homeowners may submit concerns, but final decisions rest with HOA leadership. Sincerely, Cynthia Holloway, HOA Compliance Consultant. I gritted my teeth. This was her opening move. Karen had tried to remove the shelter through brute force. Cynthia was going through the system. If this passed, they could legally force me to take down the shelter. No loopholes. No appeals. I couldn't let that happen. I rallied the troops. Mark called in favors from his old HOA contacts. Linda started canvassing the neighborhood, gathering signatures from residents who supported the TNR program. We needed at least 60% of the board's votes to block Cynthia's amendment. But there was a problem. Cynthia had been charming the hell out of everyone. She wasn't Karen. She wasn't abrasive, obvious, or confrontational. She was polished. Professional. She spoke in calm, reasonable tones, making it sound like this wasn't an attack, just a simple improvement to community living. And people were falling for it. By the night before the vote, we were still 2 votes short. And that's when I realized, if I wanted to win, I needed to play dirty. Late that night, I received a text from an unknown number. Unknown, I know what she's doing. Meet me at the community park in 30 minutes. I hesitated. Then, unknown, I'm on your side. But you're running out of time. I glanced at Mark and Linda. Looks like we've got a mole. Mark frowned. Could be a trap. I nodded. Or it could be exactly what we need. The park was empty when I arrived. Then, from the shadows, someone stepped forward. Janet Holloway. I tensed. You. She held up her hands. I'm not here to fight. I'm here to warn you. I folded my arms. Why would you help me? She sighed. Because Cynthia isn't just trying to pass an amendment. She's trying to take over the HOA entirely. My pulse quickened. What do you mean? Janet pulled out a folder, handing it to me. Inside were emails. Financial records. Documents showing that Cynthia was recruiting private real estate investors. She wasn't just trying to change the rules. She was trying to gut the neighborhood. If she won, she'd raise HOA fees, force out homeowners, and flip their properties to corporate buyers. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just about my cat shelter. This was about Maplewood Estates itself. And if I didn't stop her, she was going to burn the whole neighborhood down. The HOA meeting was packed. Cynthia sat at the head of the table, cool and composed. I stood up, holding Janet's folder. And I laid it all out. The documents. The emails. The proof that Cynthia was selling out the neighborhood. People gasped. A few board members visibly tensed. Cynthia's smile didn't falter. Instead, she leaned forward and said, "You have no idea who you're messing with." But that was her mistake. Because this time, neither did she. Cynthia Holloway sat at the head of the table, hands folded neatly, her expression as unreadable as stone. I stood at the front of the packed HOA meeting room, gripping the folder full of documents. I had proof. Proof that Cynthia wasn't just trying to get rid of my cat shelter, she was trying to take over the neighborhood itself. I exhaled slowly, then turned to face the homeowners. This isn't just about an HOA rule change, I said, my voice steady. This is about control. Cynthia Holloway isn't here to improve Maplewood Estates. She's here to sell it off piece by piece. Gasps spread through the room. Cynthia remained unshaken, her eyes locked on me like a predator sizing up its prey. That's a very bold accusation, she said smoothly. But do you have actual proof, Lena? Or is this just another one of your paranoid little crusades? I slapped the folder onto the table. Inside were emails, financial records, and meeting transcripts showing how Cynthia had been working behind the scenes with private real estate investors, setting the stage for massive HOA fee hikes, property violations, and forced sales. The board members began flipping through the papers, their faces draining of color as they read. Mark Reynolds leaned forward, tapping one of the pages. "So you've been planning to increase HOA fees by 40%? Murmurs of shock and outrage rippled through the crowd. Linda Morales raised her hand. "And you're planning to use those extra fees to push out long-term homeowners and sell to corporate buyers?" Cynthia's smirk faltered. She glanced at the board members, measuring her next move. Then she exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "You're all being dramatic," she said, her voice edged with frustration. "This is how communities evolve. We need funding to maintain standards. The people who can't afford it get forced out." I interrupted, my voice sharp. "That's your plan? To price out the very people who built this neighborhood?" A few board members looked at each other, uneasy. Cynthia sighed. "I understand that change is difficult for some of you. This isn't change," I snapped. "It's a scam. You're trying to bleed this community dry." The room erupted into arguments. Some homeowners, especially the wealthier ones who stood to benefit from rising property values, tried to defend Cynthia. Others, especially the longtime residents, were furious. But I wasn't done. I turned to the board. "We need to vote now. Not just on Cynthia's amendment, but on whether or not she should even be in charge." Cynthia's head snapped up. "You can't do that." Mark leaned back in his chair. "Actually, we can." A motion was proposed. A vote was cast. And when the final count was announced, Cynthia Holloway was removed from the HOA. Her own allies had turned on her. And just like that, she lost everything. The meeting ended in chaos. Homeowners whispered, some in shock, others in quiet triumph. Cynthia sat motionless, her fingers tapping against the polished table. Then, slowly, she stood, smoothed down her expensive navy suit, and walked toward me. She leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. "You think this is over," she said. I met her gaze. "I know it is." Cynthia's lips curled into something between a smile and a snarl. "You have no idea who you just crossed, Lena." Then she turned and walked out. For the next few days, I expected retaliation. Karen had been impulsive, Roger had been corrupt, but Cynthia? She was smart. I kept my security cameras on, double-checked my property records, even scanned my bank accounts for any weird activity. But then, Cynthia vanished. She didn't fight the vote. Didn't try to rally support. One day, she was Maplewood Estate's newest power player. The next, she was gone. No one knew where she went. No forwarding address. No final smear campaign. Just silence. And somehow, that was even worse. Maplewood Estates finally stabilized. With Cynthia gone, the HOA was rebuilt from the ground up. New board members were elected, people who actually cared about the community. The constant violations stopped. The ridiculous fines disappeared. And my cat shelter? Still standing. Mittens, Shadow, and the rest of the colony were safe. For the first time since moving here, I felt like I could finally call this place home. One evening, as I stepped outside to refill the shelter, I noticed something. A small white envelope tucked into my mailbox. No return address. No stamp. I felt a familiar chill crawl up my spine. I opened it. Inside was a single piece of paper. A typed note. "You won this battle. But I'm not finished yet. See you soon." No name. No signature. But I knew exactly who sent it. Cynthia. She was still out there. And something told me. This war wasn't over. It was just beginning. I stood on my porch, staring at the letter in my hand, the inked words burning into my mind. "You won this battle. But I'm not finished yet. See you soon." No name. No signature. But I didn't need one. Cynthia was back. For a long moment, I just stood there, gripping the note so tightly my fingers ached. I had one. Cynthia had been voted out, exposed for the fraud she was. She had disappeared without a fight. But now? She was planning something. And I had a feeling it would make everything Karen, Roger, and George had done look like child's play. The next morning, I stepped outside to check on the cat shelter, and my stomach dropped. The roof was gone. The straw was scattered. The water bowls were overturned. It wasn't just vandalism. It was a message. I checked the security cameras, but the footage was corrupted. Cynthia. She had either sent someone to do this, or she had done it herself. And that meant one thing. She was back in town. And she was already making her move. That afternoon, I got a call from Mark Reynolds. "You're not going to like this," he said grimly. I sat up straight. "What?" "There's an emergency HOA meeting scheduled for tonight. No warning. No agenda. Just a vague notice about community restructuring." My stomach tightened. This wasn't normal. This was Cynthia. She had disappeared after her humiliating defeat. But now she was trying to worm her way back in. I wasn't about to let that happen. The HOA meeting room was packed. Residents filled every chair, some even standing in the back. A murmur of confusion and suspicion buzzed through the air. And then, Cynthia Holloway walked in. She was dressed in a crisp gray suit, her hair pinned back, her usual cool expression locked in place. I felt the energy in the room shift. Some people were wary, but others were nodding, whispering. Cynthia had been working behind the scenes. She hadn't just come back, she had allies. She took the podium, clearing her throat. "Good evening, everyone. I know my exit from the HOA was sudden, but I want to assure you, I never stopped caring about Maplewood Estates." I narrowed my eyes. This was a setup. Cynthia wasn't here to apologize. She was here to take back control. And when she dropped her next bombshell, the entire room gasped. "I have been appointed as an HOA compliance officer, effective immediately." My heart slammed against my ribs. "What?" I blurted out, standing. "That's not how this works." Cynthia gave me a smooth, condescending smile. "Actually, it is. The board voted, and the majority agreed that Maplewood needs stronger leadership in maintaining our community standards." Mark muttered, "This is bad." Linda whispered, "She found a way in without being elected." Cynthia folded her hands. "Now onto the first order of business." She pulled out a document and set it on the table. A new amendment proposal. One that would ban all outdoor shelters and feeding stations, and fine anyone who violated it. My vision went red. Cynthia had found a way to finish what Karen started. And if I didn't stop her, the cats were done for. I stayed up late that night, digging through every HOA policy book I could find. If Cynthia wanted to play the legal game, I had to beat her at it. That's when I found something. A pattern. Cynthia had been involved in HOA takeovers before. Not just here, in other communities too. Her strategy was always the same. Force new regulations onto homeowners. Fine them until they couldn't keep up. Push them out and flip their properties to real estate investors. It was exactly what she had tried to do before. And now? She was doing it again. And she was starting with me. The very next morning, I woke up to a fresh stack of HOA violation notices in my mailbox. Notice: unauthorized outdoor structure. Your unapproved cat shelter must be removed immediately. Failure to comply will result in fines. Notice: community cleanliness violation. Outdoor pet food creates an unsanitary environment. Fines will be issued for continued violations. Notice: excessive complaint reports. Multiple neighbors have expressed concerns about your property upkeep. You are being placed under compliance review. I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was so damn predictable. Cynthia had declared war. And if she thought I was going to back down, she had no idea who she was messing with. I made 3 calls. First, to Animal Welfare Services. Officer Gregson picked up. "Lena, let me guess, someone's messing with your shelter again." "Not just messing with it," I said. "They're trying to ban it outright." Gregson's voice hardened. "Send me the documents. I'll see what I can do." Second, to the local news. A journalist named Megan Thompson had covered the original HOA scandal when we took down Roger and George. She picked up immediately. "Lena? What's happening now?" "You're gonna want to bring your camera," I said. Because the HOA just tried to make saving animals illegal. And the third call? To my lawyer. Because if Cynthia wanted a legal war, I was more than ready to give her one. The next HOA meeting was different. Not just because I showed up with a stack of legal documents, but because I wasn't alone. A local news crew was parked outside, and when Cynthia saw them, her composed mask cracked. "You called the press?" she hissed. I smiled. I thought transparency was important for community decisions. She glared daggers at me. Then I slapped a cease and desist order onto the table. "This is from Animal Welfare Services. If you enforce your new rule, you'll be in violation of state animal protection laws." Murmurs rippled through the room. "And this," I continued, dropping another stack of papers, "is from my lawyer. You've been harassing me through fraudulent violations. If you don't back off, we'll be taking this to court." Cynthia's hands curled into fists. She had lost. Again. And she knew it. A week later, Cynthia resigned from the HOA. She left Maplewood Estates entirely, vanishing just like before. Her plans had crumbled. And my cat shelter? Still standing. I had one again. And this time, there was no coming back for her. The war was finally over. For the first time in years, Maplewood Estates was finally quiet. No more HOA harassment. No more mysterious violation notices. No more power-hungry board members trying to take over the neighborhood. Cynthia Holloway was gone. Or so I thought. Because exactly 1 month later, I woke up to find a bulldozer parked in front of my house. And a man in a city construction uniform standing in my yard, clipboard in hand. "Ms. Carter?" he asked. "Yeah?" I said slowly. He checked his notes. "We're here to begin community redevelopment." My blood turned to ice. "What redevelopment?" I asked. He flipped through his papers. "The Maplewood Estates Beautification Project. Approved last month. This lot is scheduled for green space improvements, which means..." He gestured toward my yard. "This structure has to be removed." I looked at where he was pointing. My cat shelter. The blood drained from my face. Cynthia. She hadn't just lost and left. She had set this up before she disappeared. A final, legal way to destroy everything I had fought for. And the worst part? It had already been approved. I didn't have time to panic. I needed a plan. Fast. I pulled out my phone and made 3 calls. First, to Animal Welfare Services. Gregson answered immediately. "Lena? We have a problem," I said, explaining the situation. Silence. Then, "That's not legal. They can't just destroy a registered community shelter." "Well, they're about to," I said. "Unless you can stop them." Gregson cursed under his breath. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. Second, to the news. Megan Thompson, the local reporter who had covered the HOA scandal, picked up on the first ring. "Tell me you're not calling about another HOA disaster," she said. I gritted my teeth. "It's worse." 5 seconds of silence. "Then I'll send a crew." Third, to the city council. I had one last ace up my sleeve. A few months ago, after Karen and Roger fell, I had worked with Mark Reynolds to pass new community guidelines for property protection. If I could prove that my shelter fell under those protections, the city wouldn't be able to touch it. A receptionist answered. "City Hall, how can I help you?" "This is Lena Carter," I said, voice tight. "I need to speak with someone about an emergency zoning dispute." By the time Gregson arrived, the bulldozer crew was already lining up their equipment. A small crowd of neighbors gathered, murmuring in confusion. And then, the news van pulled up. Cynthia's carefully orchestrated demolition was about to become very public. Gregson stepped out of his car, marched straight up to the construction foreman, and flashed his badge. "You're in violation of state animal protection laws," he said. The foreman blinked. "We're just following city orders." "The city's about to get a lawsuit," Gregson snapped. "Unless this project is halted immediately." The foreman hesitated. Then he pulled out his phone and made a quick call. Meanwhile, I stepped forward, facing the city project coordinator. "This shelter is protected under community property rights," I said, handing him my documents. "This bulldozer isn't touching it." The man skimmed the papers. His frown deepened. More cars pulled up. city officials, lawyers, even a few HOA board members who had no idea this was happening. And then, Cynthia arrived. She stepped out of a sleek black SUV, sunglasses on, looking every bit like a CEO surveying her empire. But when she saw the cameras, the news crew, and the legal representatives, she froze. And I saw it. For the first time ever, Cynthia was rattled. Cynthia straightened her blazer and walked toward me, her expression smooth. "Lena," she said, smiling like this was some kind of misunderstanding. I crossed my arms. "Cynthia." She gestured at the construction team. "This is just a beautification project." "The community." Gregson cut her off. "The community didn't approve this. You faked the vote." The city official frowned. "Ms. Holloway, is that true?" Cynthia hesitated. For one fatal second, she didn't have a polished answer. The city official's expression darkened. He pulled out his phone. "I need to check something," he muttered. Meanwhile, Megan Thompson's cameraman zoomed in on Cynthia's face. She knew. She had been caught. 30 minutes later, the city officials canceled the project. The bulldozer crew left. The HOA board, furious that Cynthia had gone behind their backs, revoked her position permanently. And as for Cynthia, she didn't wait for the formal legal consequences. That night, she packed up and left town. No announcement. No final attempt at revenge. Just gone. And this time? For good. A few months later, Mark and I sat on my porch, watching as Mittens, Shadow, and Rusty curled up in the cat shelter, safe, warm, and completely undisturbed. "You finally won," Mark said, shaking his head. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of every battle, every threat, every ridiculous HOA war finally lift off my shoulders. "Yeah," I said, smiling. "I did. No more Karen. No more Roger. No more George. No more Cynthia. Just a quiet neighborhood, a well-earned victory, and a little shelter that had survived it all." And as I sat there, listening to the peaceful night, I knew. This war was finally over. For good. For the first time since moving to Maplewood Estates, there were no more battles to fight. No more HOA tyrants trying to control the neighborhood. No more mysterious violation notices appearing in my mailbox. No more late-night intimidation tactics or underhanded legal loopholes designed to push me out. Karen was gone. Roger was gone. George was gone. And now Cynthia was gone too. I had won. And more importantly, the cats had won. Mittens, Shadow, Rusty, and the rest of the colony still had their safe haven, untouched and protected. The HOA had been restructured, this time led by people who actually cared about the community, not just their own power. And as I sat on my porch, sipping a cup of coffee, watching the cats curl up in the shelter that had started this whole war, I finally felt it. Peace. No more battles. No more enemies. Just a home that was finally mine. And as the sun set over Maplewood Estates, I smiled. Because I knew. This war was over. For good.